My name is Leela Gandhi, and I'm delighted to welcome you to a Race in a Global Frame public lecture from the Humanities in the World initiative at the Kogut Institute at Brown University. The Humanities in the World initiative explores two areas of inquiry: the global dimension of humanities scholarship and the role of the humanities in society. It is my absolute honor to welcome our speaker today. Banu Bargu is Associate Professor of History of Consciousness at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She has previously taught at the New School for Social Research in New York City and the School for Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. And she's been a member at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton. Professor Bargu's incredible work engages modern and contemporary political thought with a thematic focus on theories of sovereignty, biopolitics, and resistance. Her research is situated at the intersection of philosophy, politics, history, and political anthropology, with a regional emphasis on the Middle East, especially Turkish politics. To these academic fields, diverse academic fields, Bargu brings the perspective of salient political issues and current resistance practices around questions of violence, the body, sacrifice, martyrdom, and aesthetics. Her first book, Starve and Immolate: The Politics of Human Weapons, Columbia University Press 2014, received the first book prize given by the American Political Science Association's Foundations of Political Theory section, and it was named an outstanding academic title by Choice. It explores the use of the body in self-destructive protest in the specific context of Turkish prisons through the ethnography of a radical movement. Through these materials, Bargu advances her stand-out and hugely generative postulate of the weaponization of life as an emergent repertoire of political action as such. Professor Bargu's essays have appeared in eminent venues as Diacritics, Contemporary Political Theory, Angelaki, Theory and Event, South Atlantic Quarterly, Kipal, and Constellations. She's editor of Turkey's Necropolitical Laboratory, Democracy, Violence and Resistance, 2019, and co-editor of a special issue of Rethinking Marxism on Louis Althusser, and of the volume Feminism, Capitalism and Critique, 2017. Her new book, Corporeal Counterpolitics, is forthcoming from Oxford University Press in 2022. Professor Banu Bargu addresses us today on the topic Corporeal Critique. The lecture delineates a terrain of somaticizations that can act as a reservoir of resistance against conditions of oppression and injustice. Please join me, albeit virtually, in welcoming her very warmly and with gratitude to Brown. Professor Bargu.
Professor Gandhi, thank you so much for the invitation and for this very, very generous introduction. For a long time, I've been working on a range of actions around the world, especially in the global south, involving self-endangerment, self-injury, and self-destruction, such as human shielding practices, lip sewings, hunger strikes, and self-immolations. These are all performances in which bodily agency comes forth. They're expressive acts that often defy a simple instrumentalist framing. They emerge as actions or reactions to crisis conditions in sites marked by great asymmetries of power, most frequently in sites of confinement and conflict, such as border zones, war zones, urban curfew zones, detention centers, and prisons. They tend to arise in situations characterized by the conjunction of different forms of violence, instances of physical violence, such as torture and police brutality, but also acutely structural forms of violence, such as poverty, patriarchy, and racism, and various forms of what I call indignifying violence, involving acts of humiliation and assaults to identity, all experienced as irreversible injustices. So in response, the acts that I'm interested in put forward an agency that resists, that critiques and refuses those injustices. And in this paper, I explore how the body's agency can manifest as resistance. It's my attempt to think about how it's possible to advance a critique of the social order by way of the body. So let me begin. Introducing his trenchant observations regarding mental disorders suffered by Algerian people under colonial domination and during the violent struggle for liberation, mental disorders that he viewed as symptoms of the scope and depth of the wounds inflicted on the colonized. Franz Fanon argues that the question of colonial power and the definition of what it means to be human are inextricably intertwined. He writes, I quote, "Because it is a systematized negation of the other, a frenzied determination to deny the other any attribute of humanity, colonialism forces the colonized to constantly ask the question, who am I in reality?" If the colonists' denial of humanity to the colonized made the question of the human ever more pertinent, the very possibility of raising the question by the colonized itself depended on a self-understanding that differed from the forms of dehumanization that colonialism foisted upon them. This self-understanding, even when it was imbricated with self-doubt and the interiorization of attributed inferiority, even when it was not fully articulated beyond the basic coordinates of cultural, national, religious, or racial difference, and perhaps even more so when it was not thus articulated, afforded the colonized the experiential basis to doubt, question, contest, and refuse that foisting in both individual and collective ways. In The Wretched of the Earth, Fanon shows that a central foundation for that self-understanding is the corporeal experience of domination that leads to manifold forms of physical and psychic suffering. Suffering is both a symptom of domination and a consequence of its deleterious impact, but also, at least potentially, the basis of its questioning and contestation. Fanon suggests the ways in which corporeal experiences can be significant moments that go into the making of a revolutionary subject. For Fanon, as for other critics of the colonial project, colonization reflects a desire not only to control, but also to tame. Fanon identifies the project of colonial governance with domestication when he writes, "A hostile, ungovernable, and fundamentally rebellious nature is in fact synonymous in the colonies with the bush, the mosquitoes, the natives, and disease. Colonization has succeeded once this untamed nature has been brought under control. Cutting railroads through the bush, draining swamps, and ignoring the political and economic existence of the native population are in fact one and the same thing," end of quote. In Algeria Unveiled, written a few years before his Wretched of the Earth, Fanon draws attention to how women and their bodies become an important battleground in the project of domestication, with the veil becoming the symbolic stake of battle. Women's conversion to the colonial project, symbolized by their unveiling, is presented as their emancipation from medieval and barbaric practices, a step out of their humiliated, sequestered, and cloistered status into modern subjecthood, with the potential to transform Algerian culture. Still today, contends Fanon in 1959, the dream of total domestication of Algerian society by means of unveiled women aiding and sheltering the occupier continues to haunt colonial authorities. But this project of domestication turns out to be a colonialist fantasy that always seeks fulfillment in its totality, but is frequently frustrated, both because it is not potent enough to conquer nature, and because nature is, as Fanon puts it, fundamentally rebellious. Mosquitoes keep coming back, the bush proliferates around the railroads, despite all the swamps drained, there's more wilderness that surrounds and always threatens to enclose the newly drained fields. And the veil is transformed from being, as Fanon puts it, a formerly inert element of the native cultural imagination, native cultural configuration, to an entrenched center of resistance, even made into a cult. Even where each of the colonized is subjected to intense domination, such that not only dress and comportment, but according to Fanon, even the individual's breathing is observed, an occupied breathing, a combat breathing, where each individual must combat the sustained work of cleanup, of expulsion of self, of rationally pursued mutilation, end of quote. By colonialism, the project of domestication runs up against new ways of resistance that the colonized invent, ways which play on the possibility of dissimulation, since the unsuspecting colonists only expect the Fatmas, the stereotypical name they call Algerian women working in their homes. Unveiling then becomes a tactic for penetrating colonist quarters, or conversely, the veil becomes a form of camouflage for smuggling weapons. If colonialism attempts to transform the colonized at the corporeal level, resistance too entails the constitution of a new relationship with one's body, the reconfiguration of how to move and comport one's body through the world, born out of the suffering inflicted by colonialism and participation in revolutionary struggle. All the while, subtending both domination and resistance is the constant presence of the question, who am I in reality? Today, drawing on Fanon's acute insights, I focus on theorizing the gap between the body as the site of suffering and the body as the source of resistance. I'm particularly interested in forms of bodily comportment that are suggestive of the impossibility of the body's total domestication or subsumption into relations of power. I use somatization to conceptualize such forms of agency that are no doubt born out of the multiple forms of violence through which the body is shaped into a political object, but which mediate these impacts through the body's own prism in ways that refuse the automatic reproduction of power relations in the form of compliance, conformity, and obedience. These forms of bodily agency emerge as expressions of crisis, which can translate experiences of suffering into forms of critique, resistance, and refusal. Thinking with Fanon offers the opportunity to distill different forms of somatization that emerge in the crisis conditions produced by the effects of coloniality as an ensemble of violence, and to discern the particular ways in which this ensemble functions to gender, race, and class bodies. In this endeavor, I put Fanon in conversation with two European thinkers who've pioneered attempts to theorize the body in its agentiality before Fanon, Marcel Mauss and Helmuth Plessner. Through the triangulation of these three thinkers' insights, I aim to explore how the agential capacity of the body may orient itself not only to express the suffering inflicted by domination, but also to perform its elementary critique. So let me take up each thinker in turn. Marcel Mauss's groundbreaking essay on techniques of the body, published in 1935, explores how the body is man's first and most natural instrument. Mauss argues, not to speak of instruments, it is man's first and most natural technical object, and at the same time, technical means, the body. Mauss thereby points to a domain of actions in which the body assumes a triple role as a subject that acts, as one's own object that is acted upon, and as one's means as a subject to work on the object. Attending to how humans use their bodies, Mauss's work takes off from his observation that apparently physiological and therefore universal bodily practices, such as walking and swimming, are in fact highly specific to different societies. He contends, the Polynesians do not swim as we do. My generation did not swim as the past generation does. What most called bodily techniques then designate collective forms of the art of using the human body in each society, transmitted by tradition and inculcated through education. According to Mauss, these techniques concern anything from walking, running, resting, swimming, and dancing to the marching of armies. Bodily practices in his conception are socially inculcated regularities in comportment that are culturally and historically specific. They are physio-psychosociological assemblages, as he calls them, suggesting a triple viewpoint among physiognomy, individual psychology, and society, in which these forces are indissolubly mixed. Mauss discusses how individual performance and social norms are inseparable. Already contained in the imitation of an action is the successfully performed action, performed by those with authority and prestige over and above the individual, thus making it impossible to disentangle individual imitation from socialization and subjectivation. Highlighting the collective nature of bodily techniques, their acquisition by training, their social reproduction by customs and intergenerational transmission, instead of being merely a matter of individual attitudes and variations, Mauss is the first to propose the term habitus in place of habit. Mauss thus draws attention to how bodily practices constitute a site where society's inscriptions could be read. In so doing, he offers a prescient theorization of differentiation, of how a body is gendered, classed, and acquires social status, how it becomes specific to cultures, even civilizations, through its comportments. By locating differentiation in bodily practices rather than the body per se, Mauss moves away from embodiment, which can be abstract and reified, toward more specific, tangible, and observable phenomena that are always open to transformation. In elaborating how bodies are differentiated, Mauss underscores distinction in bodily techniques based on the performer's age, levels of efficiency cultivated by training, and dexterity. He notes the sexual differentiation of these bodily techniques when, for example, a woman throws a stone instead of a man. He says, and everyone knows that a woman's throwing of a stone, for example, is not just weak, but always different from that of a man, in a vertical instead of a horizontal plane. Similarly, he goes on to say, a man normally closes his fist with the thumb outside, a woman with her thumb inside. Through the inculcation of different techniques of throwing and closing one's fist, Mauss surmises the social gendering of the body and the construction of differential norms of comportment. In this context, Mauss references a specific gait that the Maori girl has to master based on the swaying of her hips. I quote, mothers drilled their daughters in this accomplishment, termed onioni, and scolded them for neglecting to practice the gait, end of quote. In addition to the ordinary comportments of walking, throwing a stone, and making a fist that differentiate gendered bodies, Mauss also highlights how cultural differentiation works through gendered bodily techniques such as childbirth, whether it's standing up or lying down, and child rearing, how the child is carried, nursed, weaned, cradled, etc., creating diverse bodily practices across societies. At the same time, however, Mauss suggests that just as the body becomes the vehicle of reproducing social norms of bodily practice, it also acts as a site that innovates, refuses, and refracts those norms. Swimming techniques can change from one generation to another, showing the possibility of innovation, while Maori girls can disrupt the smooth transmission of the onioni by not obeying and replicating how they're supposed to walk, and will therefore be chided by their mothers for it. Mauss's work thus provides an incipient theory of social reproduction coupled with a theory of its disruption, not only of how the individual body gets shaped by society all the way down to its basic movements, but also how this shaping, which becomes the vehicle of social reproduction, is a continuous struggle straddled with tensions, disruptions, and innovations in which the body is never quite tamed or domesticated. In keeping with his insight that each society has its own special habits, Mauss makes many observations about manners. For example, the polite and impolite ways of keeping hands vary. For the English, elbows have to be kept in while not eating, whereas for the French, this is not the case. He writes, excuse me, a young Frenchman has no idea how to sit up straight. His elbows stick out sideways. He puts them on the table and so on. Mauss notes that there are different ways of sleeping that are culturally determined, with or without neck rests, with or without mats, lying down, standing up, or even while riding a horse. Even though these bodily comportments are transmitted through cultural training, Mauss contends, they tend to shape individuals in ways that make it difficult to switch from one to the other. For example, noting the different ways of resting, such as sitting, squatting, or standing on one leg across societies, Mauss highlights how such practices may change human physiognomy, such as the curvature of the legs, form of tendons and bones, which can be falsely attributed to hereditary factors. In societies that do not squat, that is, in the West, in societies which Mauss refers to as ours, Mauss laments the loss of the ability to do so and considers it a sign of inferiority insofar as it deprives bodies from the advantages of such movement. For many interpreters of Mauss, such comments indicate his cultural relativism, in which one finds not an unquestionable civilizational hierarchy, but one in which different cultures may present varied advantages vis-a-vis one another. However, Mauss's comments regarding the differentiation of races contain more troubling implications. His point is not only that the Polynesians swim differently than the French, which may be superior in technique, or that the French loss of the ability to squat is a relative weakness. Mauss also maintains that the distinction between civilized and uncivilized societies resides in how differences in composure are cultivated through education. In other words, whether and how disorderly movements, as he calls them, such as those under the influence of emotion, would be inhibited and goal-oriented, coordinated movements be privileged. As Mauss forcefully puts it, this resistance to emotional seizure is something fundamental in social and mental life. It separates out, even classifies the so-called primitive societies according to whether they display more brutal, unreflected, unconscious reactions, or on the contrary, more isolated, precise actions governed by a clear consciousness. For Mauss, the domination of conscious and controlled bodily techniques over emotion and unconsciousness is the sign of civilized society. The distinction Mauss makes between brutal, unreflected, unconscious reactions, that is, actions dominated by the seizure of emotions, versus goal-oriented actions governed by a clear consciousness, is a crucial one that has implicitly structured his approach to bodily agency, as well as the approach of many subsequent sociologists of the body, leading to the privileging of goal-oriented actions in the interpretation of bodily practices. The implicit hierarchicalization of bodily practices, informed not necessarily by an overtly racist conception, but by more insidious yet effective civilizationist premises, has consigned the dominant conception of bodily agency to the domain of composure, instrumental action, order, and coordination, discounting the value of the affective, connoting expressive bodily action with less civility, and finally undermining the general value of Mauss's acknowledgement of cultural difference. While Mauss's work is an important starting point in theorizing bodily practice as a materialist heuristic to analyze cultural, social, and political registers of human agency, it thus remains too generic in its conception of practice and approaches the body almost exclusively in the form of its bearers, instruments, and objects. It does not attend to the specificity of those bodily practices that are predominantly affective, non-reflective, imprecise, or unconscious. Complementing Mauss's emphasis on bodily practices that are predominantly conscious and rational is Helmuth Plessner's work, which is exemplary in the way it approaches bodily practices that are expressive. Plessner theorizes expressive practices as immediate, spontaneous, and unintentional movements that involve the whole body. He's interested in the whole range of emotive expressions, such as joy, love, and envy, but his main contribution to the theorization of bodily practices is in identifying the specificity of laughing and crying. For him, laughing and crying are distinguished forms of expression that not only solely belong to humans, but are also very different from other practices that distinguish humans from other living things, such as language and other forms of expressive movement, which have a symbolic character. Arguing against traditional interpretations of laughing and crying as the outer expression of the inner reality of the human, whether called mind or soul, based on a dualistic Cartesian ontology, where the body and the mental attributes are separated as outer and inner, Plessner suggests we grasp expression in its living context as a, quote, unity of intellectual, affective, and physical components, end of quote. For Plessner, from this holistic point of view, I quote again, forms of expression are forms of behavior toward others, toward oneself, toward things, events, and everything that people can encounter. These forms do not lie within the fenced-off area of consciousness, providing isolation from external reality, not in the inner or outer aspect of human existence, but rather athwart all these antitheses. End of quote. Transcending Cartesian dualism is possible for Plessner on the basis of the structural analysis of human experience afforded by the perspective of phenomenology, one that highlights not only the duality of being a body and being in a body, but also what Plessner calls the eccentric position, namely the ability to have a reflexive orientation toward oneself and the world. Said differently, a human both is a living body and has a living body, lived body in a physical body. These two orders are fundamentally intertwined. At the same time, the human is neither just a living body nor just has a body. As Plessner puts it, every requirement of physical existence demands a reconciliation between being and having, outside and inside. The relationship between these two is one's relation to oneself, or one's relationship as subject and object of oneself, not reducible to either alone. The reflexivity of one's duality distinguishes human embodiment from that of other beings, and this reflexivity is in turn deeply shaped by one's relationship to the world and with others. Considering laughing and crying vis-a-vis other emotive expressions, Plessner highlights how they lack a symbolic character, how they erupt and are compulsive. In this respect, they're closer to involuntary actions such as blushing, turning pale, coughing, sneezing. They are sudden, they lack transition or gradation, but they're also different from involuntary practices in that they direct themselves to the situation and interrupt the course of normal daily life. Plessner further specifies that laughing and crying are, I quote, forms of expression of a crisis precipitated in certain situations by the relationship of a man to his body, a relation which is a form of behavior as well, and not a piece of fixed machinery on which one need only to rely, end of quote. So these are eruptions, moments in which we lose control, situations that throw our relation to our bodies into disarray. Said differently, laughing and crying exemplify situations in which it's not a particular emotion that's being expressed, but the loss of control in the whole context. In life-threatening occasions, this can manifest as vertigo. Plessner writes, man capitulates as a person, he loses his head. Symptoms which are known to arise from giddiness, such as perspiring, nausea, and fainting can, as we know, arise in similar crises of a higher order, end of quote. In lesser crises, laughing and crying constitute the capitulation. In the process, the body takes over, no longer as an instrument of action, language, gesture, or expressive movement, but, he insists, as body. The capitulation is a sign that the situation is unanswerable except by a loss of control. At the same time, the capitulation turns into an act of reclamation. Plessner writes, by slipping as if by accident into a physical process and giving way to it, a process opaque in itself, which runs its course compulsively, by the disorganization of one's inner balance, man at once forfeits the relation to his body and reestablishes it, end of quote. Plessner's perspective on laughing and crying offers an important corrective to Mauss's analysis of bodily techniques. It draws our attention to those expressive practices that elude an instrumental relation between the human as subject and as object. Indeed, it centers on precisely those practices which exceed and upend that instrumentality. Such a reversal or undoing of instrumentality is possible because of the material excess of the body, which defies the possibility of continuous composure, of complete subsumption, or domestication. Plessner reminds us that there remains an ineradicable opacity in the body. Such expressive practices also upend the divide between what Mauss labeled the brutal, unreflected, unconscious reactions and clearly conscious ones oriented toward goals, opening the path for a questioning of the implicit superiority that Mauss attaches to the latter as the hallmark of civilization, understood as achievable by training in composure among otherwise culturally diverse bodily practices. Instead, Plessner shows it is in moments of crisis, when one loses composure, so to speak, that a universal dimension of the human shines forth. While laughing and crying are perhaps the most universal forms of comportment, I quote, despite all historical change, all varieties of jest, wit, drollery, humor, irony, pain, and tragedy, end of quote, they are nonetheless the most opaque. This opacity is the basis of Plessner's principle of unfathomability, namely his refusal to attribute an essential definition to the human. When Plessner denied an essence to what is human, he could not have imagined how this foundational principle of his political anthropology might resonate with the colonized and their search for alternative conceptions of humanity. Plessner maintained, not only do men change, what is human is also altered in the changing course of time. As if in response, Fanon would affirm how Algerian men and women were reinventing what it means to be human in the course of their war of liberation. I quote, "The men and women of Algeria today resemble neither those of 1930, nor those of 1954, nor yet those of 1957. The old Algeria is dead. All the innocent blood that has flowed onto the national soil has produced a new humanity," end of quote. For Fanon, this new humanity was forged in struggle, but the experiential basis of it had been long in the making under the racialized gaze of colonial domination. Let us recall how in Black Skin, White Masks, Fanon famously describes his own experience of being seen as a Black man by a child. The objectifying gaze of whiteness fixes the Black male body as an object of fear, object of desire, and the symbol of evil, and renders impossible a natural relation to one's own body schema without the mediation of the structuring effect of racialization. But the amputation of one's being, as Fanon powerfully calls the effect of racial debasement, is experienced most acutely in moments of crisis. When the child shouts, "Maman, look, a Negro, I'm scared," Fanon writes, "I wanted to kill myself laughing, but laughter had become out of the question." In the train, noting the seats left empty surrounding him, Fanon continues, "I was no longer enjoying myself. I was unable to discover the feverish coordinates of the world. I existed in triple. I was taking up room. I approached the other, and the other, evasive, hostile, but not opaque, transparent and absent, vanished. Nausea." End of quote. In the span of a few sentences, Fanon captures the loss of being at peace with oneself. Using Plessner's language, he describes how he concedes control over to his body. Nausea, disorientation, fear, and alienation. Fanon's eccentric position allows him to understand how these somatizations lead to the conception of himself as an object that attacks itself. I quote, "I transported myself on that particular day far, very far from myself, and gave myself up as an object. What did this mean to me? Peeling, stripping my skin, causing a hemorrhage that left congealed black blood all over my body." End of quote. For Fanon, his self-understanding, his lived experience of being human ruptures how blackness is foisted upon him. In other words, the way in which his body is transformed into a racialized object contradicts his relation to his own body. In the crisis precipitated by the acute moment of witnessing and being subjected to the reproduction of the social norms that racialize and gender bodies through practices ventriloquized by a child's utterance, Fanon's corporeal experience allows him to contest that foisting. He gives in and lets himself be taken over by his body. He writes, "I began to weep." His objectification meets refusal at a visceral level by his body's somatic response. Thus ends the powerful chapter on the lived experience of the Black man. Crying is not simply the reflection of the violence of the white gaze as lived by the Black body, nor a simple reaction to it. It's a visceral refusal of that reification. As Plessner has shown, crying is precisely the loss of control in an unanswerable situation in which the body takes over the answer for him. It is a way that signifies the rupture of Fanon's experience with his sense of self and desire. I quote, "To be a man among men, to be a man and nothing but a man." Crying is precisely what allows Fanon to reconstitute his sense of self. But crying is only one form of somatization among others. In The Wretched of the Earth, Fanon sheds light on how the colonial order, its hierarchical structures and modes of social relation are viscerally and psychically experienced, how the various forms of violence in the colonial ensemble of power are somatized by the colonized body, how these effects are deflected and displaced into different realms of everyday life. For example, Fanon talks about how the colonized, I quote, "grow tense and how their muscles seize up against the aggressive assertions of the superiority of Western values and the deprecation of indigenous culture." He references how the colonized have muscular dreams, dreams of action, dreams of aggressive vitality, dreams which contradict the states of impotence and inaction the colonized find themselves to be reduced. How their aggression is directed at their own people, manifesting in violent crimes, burdened with a presumption of guilt, internalized sense of inferiority, and repressed rage. Finally, Fanon suggests that the growth in fatalism, the broad field of superstition and magic that governs everyday life, and the instances of spirit possession all constitute corporeal manifestations of the latent violence of the structural ordering of colonial Algeria, deflected and refracted through the social imaginary. Excuse me. On the whole, in the colonial ensemble of violence, the body becomes a repository of indignity and despair. Fanon argues, the militant very often realizes that not only must he hunt down the enemy forces, but also the core of despair crystallized in the body of the colonized. End of quote. When the Algerian woman unveils as part of the struggle, not only does she have to relearn how to walk, how to control her body, how to be comfortable without her traditional dress, but she also has to recompose and reconstitute her relation to her own body. This reconstitution begins from a sense of anxiety, fear, and dissolution that are deeply embodied. She must overcome herself in order to proceed. Each time she ventures into the European city, contends Fanon, the Algerian woman must achieve a victory over herself, over her childish fears. She must consider the image of the occupier lodged somewhere in her mind and in her body, remodel it, initiate the essential work of eroding it, make it inessential, remove something of the shame that is attached to it, devalidate it. End of quote. In the absence of anti-colonial political struggle, experiences of anxiety, rage, psychosomatic illness, dance, and spirit possession can act as outlets for the accumulated aggression against the colonial order, outlets that lead to the dissipation of insurgent sentiment. However, in moments of crisis, all the suppressed rage, emasculation, humiliation, and oppression lived in the body, in the muscular tension, in the internalized sense of depersonalization that reflects through one's posture and gait, can lead to the body taking over, enabling the relation between the self and the body to be reconfigured. The moments in which bodily agency takes over the self can be considered as rehearsals, ways in which the corporeal critique of the colonized races ahead of its organized political struggle. Materialism as opposed to idealism, argues Max Horkheimer, reflecting on the history of philosophy as a battle between the two, sets itself the task to explain human suffering. By forging an immediate and unquestionable link between philosophical materialism and the question of human suffering in 1933, Horkheimer thereby defined the object and objective of a whole tradition of theoretical critique, always reaching toward the practical transformation of the world to eliminate that suffering. Over 3 decades later, Adorno would retain and affirm Horkheimer's fundamental principle when he formulated the project of negative dialectics to move philosophical materialism beyond its blinkers of identitarian and teleological thinking, positing, I quote, all pain and all negativity as the moving forces of dialectical thinking, end of quote. Adorno situated the convergence of the critical tradition with materialism precisely in response to the continuation of senseless suffering in the empirical world, the somatic experience of which acts as the stubborn non-identical, the non-conceptual remainder of any identitarian thinking. For Adorno, the body's suffering would contradict and undermine the closure of the concept. In spite of their attribution to human suffering, the important role of animating the project of critical theory, and their understanding that materialism must converge with social transformation, however, Horkheimer and Adorno, as well as many other critical thinkers after them, were constrained by their delimitation of critique to the domain of philosophy and their disinterest in actual struggles. While they recognized that the somatic experience of suffering ought to be the starting point of materialist reflection, serve as the antidote of identity, and guide them as their normative compass, they did not envision how it could act as the source of a different form of critique beyond philosophy. Corporeal critique, whose elementary forms I've traced by drawing upon Marcel Mauss, Helmuth Plessner, and Franz Fanon, involve bodily practices that challenge the neat binaries between voluntary and involuntary, conscious and unconscious, intentional and unintentional, rational and affective, and yet hold the potential of transfiguring the relation of the self to the body in response to a crisis. Whether in rage, illness, nausea, or spirit possession, or the deceptively simple acts of laughing and crying, this agency is first and foremost an expression of affliction, discontent, and malaise, but it's also the concession of the self and the emergence, indeed eruption of the body, in a way that allows the self to reconstitute its relation to the body. These thinkers allow us to analyze how the body is a hieroglyphic from which the violent imprints of a social order can be deciphered. But they also teach us how different techniques of the body can function as enactments of critique that forge dislocations between how the body is turned into an object by domination and how it is lived. They offer the theoretical foundation for understanding bodily agency, which manifests itself in ways that subvert, transgress, and append the process of social reproduction, while also reinventing what is human. At the same time, it is thanks to Fanon's anti-colonial positionality that we can finally unmoor the theory of bodily agency from its rationalist and instrumentalist articulations and question the implicit occidentalist and civilizationist presuppositions that are built into definitions of agency. Ultimately, it's worth noting that even if elementary forms of corporeal critique have been seen as less civilized or less developed forms of agency, they're often the first to emerge in the midst of crises precipitated by the civilizing process. As Fanon has shown, the body of the colonized is not only a body shaped within coloniality, but also one that thwarts total subsumption and trains subjects in disruption. From the depths of the colony, bodily agency makes itself felt as the uncolonizable remainder, the non-conceptual, the vestigial universal. Corporeal critique reflects the potentiality of the body as a living thing. It presents us with the most rudimentary forms of resistance and refusal that persistently disclose the violent underbelly of civilization, while forcing wide open the question of what it is to be human. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Bargu, for that incredible talk. I have a million questions, but so do others. And I'll begin by just reading out some that we have in the time available to us. So I have a question from Elise King-Guffey, who says, very thought-provoking and challenging. I'm reminded of scholarship that posits the body as a source of resistance and agency through acts of joy or leisure. Is this something Professor Bargu sees her work as interacting with or complementing or challenging?
Thank you for that question. And I'm sorry, maybe I went a little bit over time, but yeah, that's a great question. I don't know why, but my work is continuously, or despite myself, oriented toward pain, suffering, and violence rather than joy and leisure. So while I don't see a contradiction between different modalities in which bodily agency may manifest itself in different situations, since I am really looking at those crisis moments, I have been orienting my thinking and trying to find theoretical interlocutors to describe how the experience of suffering can transform into a form of critique. I haven't thought much about how expressions of joy, for example, could do the same, but the phenomenologists and the scholars that I've been reading, especially who've been thinking more consistently on laughter, also say that there is a moment of transformation that can be found even in tears of joy, for example, that they want to hold on to that moment of transformation. So in that sense, I think these could be complementary registers, though my work has been oriented more toward the experiences of suffering.
Thank you very much. I have a question from three people together, Elise, Yannick, and Noah, who ask, what importance should be given to media or social media in the distribution of images of bodily harm and agency for revolutionary or anti-colonial purposes? Do you see media as an indispensable tool to exacerbate the effectiveness of the body as a form of resistance?
Absolutely. I mean, these actions, so I didn't talk so much about the forms of action that my work concerns, like um, uh, self-immolation or lip sewing or hunger striking, for example. But all of the forms of resistance that I'm interested in that involve this bodily agency that I'm trying to think through is done toward others. It's done for the world. And of course, it's done in situations where it's not always possible to be seen by others. There's an immediate audience, but that's not maybe the only audience or the ultimate audience that these actions seek for themselves. And the intervention of the media and the possibility of the mediatization of the image of that suffering is extremely important in both disseminating these forms of action toward broader audiences, but also in line with the kind of expressive content that they want to offer, in the sense that, you know, if they are putting human suffering on display, so to speak, it requires to be seen. And so I think this is a very, I mean, I'm not dealing with it in this paper, but it's a very important component of these forms of protest in general. So thank you for that question.
Thank you. Before we move to the next question, I just wanted to ask you about, to draw you out on involuntarism, which is an important crux of your reading of somatization. And if I may ask you why it is such an important conceit for you. You know, I could argue, for example, that what you describe as involuntarism is something that may be free of social necessity, but may be the expression of biological necessity. You know, the term coping mechanism comes to mind, that there is, that when the body is being involuntary, it is in fact determined by another kind of somatic necessity. And yet there is something very powerful in your creative or intellectual attachment to involuntarism. And I would just like to draw you out a little more.
Thank you so much. Yes, the involuntary emphasis actually comes from Plessner,
right.
Attempt to try to differentiate laughing and crying from other forms of emotive expression that can be more voluntary and symbolic in character, like anger and joy. And partly it's a reflection of his language sort of trickling in. But in my own conceptualization, I am interested, you know, rather than labeling voluntary or involuntary, those acts that precisely trouble that distinction, that are not immediately situatable as, oh, this is definitely voluntary or this is definitely involuntary. But rather really like blur these distinctions of like, what is rational, what is affective, what is instrumental, what is expressive, because it's also true that some of these actions can be done with an instrumental purpose. I don't want to deny that. I don't want to exclude that, but that's not the only way in which these can be utilized. And in fact, if what Mauss and Plessner, if what they're saying has merit, I think they introduce us to these situations in which you can only laugh or you can only cry. Right? Before you think about how your crying will be a means to communicate something to the other. So this is, I mean, partly they're more, because they are a more old school, they're more, I think, firm in the distinctions that they make between voluntary and involuntary. I don't want to necessarily adopt that with the baggage with which it comes, but I'm interested in, you know, the kinds of actions that trouble those distinctions.
Right. That's very extremely helpful. Thank you. I have a question from Shireen Saad. Thank you. I am interested in embodied artistic resistance, i.e. the work of performance artists engaged in protest and revolutionary movements. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the impact creative movement can have. It's a similar question to...
I am also fascinated by embodied artistic resistance, I must say, and a chapter of my forthcoming book that Professor Gandhi, you kindly referenced in the introduction, is devoted to one such artist whose work I'm exploring, Peter Pawlenski, who engaged in certain acts of self-harm in order to protest the authoritarianism of the Russian government, among other things. And I think that this is a really fascinating form of art practice, and a really troubling one, because I mean the images are extremely vivid and visceral. Like Pawlenski, for example, has this image of he has sewn his lips, and it's just so mortifying as an image. It's unforgettable, and of course it raises questions of voyeurism in the audience, our investment in images of suffering, images of violence. So it's really a difficult sort of field to navigate, the artist's aims and the ways in which he strives to achieve those aims and the repercussions of his actions, etc. But I think it's a very, very powerful form that politically minded artists utilize and mobilize to draw attention to a certain cause, to make a statement of solidarity, and make an intervention, a political intervention of their own. So I mean, he's just one example that I've thought more consistently about, but there are many such artists and practitioners.
Thank you so much. I know the time is short, but I will just read out this final question from Abigail Culpepper, who says, how does one read or receive the critique performed by the body? Is this reception also a form of corporeal critique, or a translation of these performances into their meaning, significance, or perhaps something else altogether? So that, yeah.
This is an amazing question. I mean, all these questions are wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. They're very thought-provoking, and also like they hit the right nerves. How is this received? I mean, I think these actions are received on multiple registers. There is a very deeply corporeal register in which they are received. I think that's the troubling impact that they have on the viewer, insofar as they have this, is something visceral. And I think that's undeniable when you see the emaciated body of a hunger striker on the verge of death, or images of self-immolation. I mean, there's something really visceral about that, and I haven't really theorized much of the audience's reception, but that's one dimension. And I think there's also more rationalist dimension too. I mean, when human suffering is put on display, it is a kind of argument as to why this isn't just, why this isn't right. And I think that's also a different register in which people can receive the message. And there are also other registers that I just sort of dichotomize this right now, but I think it goes in multiple sort of.
Yeah, and just, I'll read this out, you don't have to answer it, but Bonnie Jones on the question of this, of reception, asks, I'm wondering about instances of bodily resistance that may not be legible, that are mute, but no less resistant. So in terms of their incommunicability and the visceral.
I mean, yes, this is always a risk. This is always a risk with every form. And maybe in bodily forms, the risk compounds of not being received.
Yeah.
And this is not simply because the agency cannot be read, but also even when it's read, you know, there's a kind of anesthetizing effect of these forms of resistance too, especially when they are done over and over, and so you know, the effects are really difficult to calculate beforehand. And, you know, sometimes one act captures the imagination. Like, for example, when Bouazizi immolated himself over a decade ago now in Tunisia. Other times, similar acts have very minimal repercussions, only, you know, within the closest circles of the people who perform them. So it's very hard to predict how they're going to be received. That's a whole other, I think, project that needs to be done, and has been done by others much better than I can. But the risk is always there, and perhaps even more so when agency is about the agency of the body.
That's wonderful. More and more questions, but I think we can ask them later, some in the seminar that follows, and the others, you know, thank you for these wonderful questions. And thank you, Professor Bargu, for an extraordinary afternoon. Yeah, very best wishes. And I will see you very soon.
Thank you so much. Thank you so very much. And I will look forward to continuing the conversation.
Bye-bye.